Good evening from Atlanta. I'm Ken Stein. I teach at Emory University, direct the Emory Institute for the Study of Modern Israel, and head the Center for Israel Education. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Rich Walter and Eli Sperling, for the technical assistance and the substantive assistance in making this webinar come to you. A bit of housekeeping, if you will. We're going to ask you to type your questions as you have them, and we shall try and answer them at the end. We will not stop the webinar in the middle to try and answer your questions. The webinar will be archived, and we will share a link to all those who signed up for the webinar. We'll share the video as well as the digital connection. And it will be available on the Emory Institute for the Study of Modern Israel website and also on the Center for Israel Education website. And we welcome you to this webinar on the Trump Plan, Context and Implications. On January 28, 2020, U.S. President Donald Trump presented his long-awaited peace plan for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. He announced the plan in Washington. It took the title of Vision for Peace, Prosperity, and a Brighter Future for Israel and the Palestinian People. The Trump plan was a unilateral statement made by the United States for a two-state solution to the Arab-Israel conflict. It contained a U.S.-Israeli agreement that set forth final borders for two states. In arriving at the plan's contents, the administration did not receive any Palestinian input to warrant a definition of what a mediated outcome should be. It was not negotiated between the parties. And as you can see from the map in front of you, that was essentially what the Trump peace plan was to look like. We'll go into further detail about it as we move forward. The plan was known as Vision for Peace and Prosperity and a Brighter Future for Israel and the Palestinian People. But let us remember, this was defined by Washington. It wasn't defined by the parties. The Trump plan focused on 5 final status issues: settlements, Jerusalem, borders, refugees, and security. In each of the suggested outcomes, the plan favored Israeli outcomes. The plan contained a promised economic development package of $50 billion to be allotted over a decade, primarily Palestinians, Jordanians, and Egyptians. No information was provided about the sources of the economic infusions. The plan contained multiple prerequisites for the Palestinians in terms of their behavior that had to be reached before either the U.S. or Israel could agree or consent to Palestinian statehood. What is new or contradicts previous plans to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? There have been many plans, many ideas put forward going back to the 1930s for a two-state solution. Many have been put forward by mediation. But this was unique for several reasons. First, it allows for Jewish settlers to remain in place on the West Bank, settlers who had found a home on the West Bank since after June of '67. It specifically stated there would be no forced population transfers. No populations would have to be uprooted or moved. It called for 2 states for 2 peoples, calls for Jerusalem to be the capital of both states, though the Palestinian portion of Jerusalem was to be significantly smaller than the Israeli portion of Jerusalem. It circumvented all UN and European Union calls for withdrawal to the 67 lines, which essentially we're not certain yet, may neutralize all those resolutions that said Jerusalem was occupied, or East Jerusalem was occupied, and the territories that Israel has controlled since 1967 is occupied. It calls for territorial enclaves, as you could see from the map earlier, and we'll go back to it in a moment. It links the Palestinian areas with bridges and tunnels, and it grants the Israelis permission to annex 30 to 40% of the lands. Let's look at the context of the boundaries going back to the 1880s. We'll do this really quickly, along with the percentages of land that were to be allocated to Jewish and Arab states along the way. The area of the Trump plan, 5860 square kilometers. Let's remember that number. The map on the left is what Palestine looked like in the 1880s. It was not a unified entity. It wasn't one state. It was made up of several different administrative areas that comprised portions of what is today present-day Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan or Jordan, and the area that is present-day Israel and the Palestinian areas. In 1992, the British decided to take the area to the left, which was mandated Palestine, which the British controlled from after World War I. And the British decided to partition Palestine for the first time by creating a country called Transjordan. And that's the area to the right. And the border on the right was arbitrarily drawn to Iraq so the British could have a land bridge from Palestine through Jordan to Iraq that would connect Palestine ultimately to the Suez Canal, which was Britain's strategic interest. That's the same map here on the left. And on the right is what the British decided in July of 1937, that after violence between the two communities, that they would have the prospects of a two-state solution. There would be a Jewish state in the orange area and an Arab state in the pink area. And the green area was supposed to be an area that would be controlled by the British, which would include Jerusalem, and obviously have a link between Jerusalem and the sea. This was 37. The idea of partition in 37 was barely accepted by the Zionists, rejected by the Arabs, and the British finally said, you know, maybe this is not a good idea. Maybe we won't think about partitioning Palestine, at least not now. The maps here is what the British suggested in 1947, coming out of the United Nations. Now, what you see on the left is the United Nations proposed map for a two-state solution. The orange area was supposed to be the Arab state. And that comprised 45% of all of mandatory Palestine that the British were controlling from 1920 through 1948. 55% was to go to the proposed Jewish state. The map on the right is the map after the Israel Independence War, or what the Palestinians have come to call the Nakba, the disaster. And why? Because Israel was created on the land primarily allocated to it to create a state in 47, but as a consequence for going to war, the Arab world or the Arab states lost a significant portion of Palestine. The 22% that we see here in this map of 1949 is approximately the same 22% that's included in the Trump plan, in which was the same 22% that Jordan would annex from 1949 until 1967, when Israel took the West Bank in the 1967 war. Let's take a look at the area west of the Jordan River. The column on the left gives you the total amount of square kilometers, 26,600. The year, partition, the Jewish state was to be 14,900. The Arab state was supposed to be 11,700. Jewish state percentage 55, Arab state percentage 45%. In 49, after the war, the Jewish state was 20,000 plus kilometers. No Arab state was created. Jordan annexed that area. In 2020, the Trump plan again states that Israel would be 20,500 kilometers. Jewish percentage 78%. Arab state proposed kilometers 5860, again 22%. Over the years, I've been taking a look at Palestinian Arab newspapers and trying to figure out how Palestinians themselves or Arabs themselves view what went on in the history of the area that became both Israel and the area that didn't become an Arab state. The first quotation is from 2006 from a very well-known Palestinian Arab writer, in which he laments that how did the partition borders become truce line borders in 49 when they don't exceed the 22% of historic Palestine? And how did the West Bank become nothing more than Swiss cheese cut by settlements? This was 2006. Let me throw you right down to 3 weeks ago in a Saudi Arabian newspaper, Ukaz. The history of the Palestinian cause has proven that the status quo is the Palestinians' number one enemy. The Palestinians and the Arabs have paid the price for every peace plan they ever rejected in the form of further concessions, from the partition plan to Clinton's plan to Trump's plan. It is worth pointing out that the Palestinian decisions have always been subject to the Arab regime's pressure and control, and they have harmed the Palestinians as much, if not more, than the Israelis. It's a rather remarkable acknowledgement or admission to appear in an Arab newspaper in 2020. This is Israel after 1967 with the West Bank under control of the Jordanians, the 5860. And this is Israel after June of 1967, now in control of the West Bank and Sinai and the Golan Heights and a good portion of Jerusalem. Israel will return Sinai to the Egyptians as a result of the negotiations that went on between 1973 and 1979. Israel's still in control of the West Bank, the Golan Heights, Jerusalem, which it conquered in 1967, and the Gaza Strip, which Israel took in 1967. It returned in 2006, 2005, 2006 to the Palestinians, and they are now in control of the Gaza Strip. What are the implications for the Trump plan, and why now? Are the Palestinians waiting for a change of government in Israel and the US before making a decision on whether to move forward or not? What we realize from the Palestinian Arab reaction, it's more than highly negative. It's condemnatory of the Trump plan. It finds the Trump plan is taking out or taking away from the Palestinians many of their cherished beliefs. The US is still the most influential outside arbiter, umpire, and engineer, and everyone still looks to the United States. That is clear from the implications of the patience that people had in awaiting the Trump plan's publication. There's no question that this plan recognizes Israel political realities on the ground. What will a new Israeli government do? Now, there are elections that are due March 2nd. We don't know if there really will be a new Israeli government that will be formed within 3 weeks or 6 weeks thereafter. Or will the Israelis go to elections again because no one major party will be able to cobble together a coalition of 61? And if there is a new government in Israel, will it move to annex land in the West Bank? Completely up in the air as a toss-up question. I would find it very difficult to even predict. Much like previous efforts in which the United States was primarily the choreographer in Arab-Israeli negotiations, the UN and Europe were discounted. After the 1973 war, Henry Kissinger paid little or no heed to the UN and virtually no attention to Europe. And we negotiated agreements between Israel and Egypt in 74 and 75. Likewise, almost no attention to the UN and Europe. And when Jimmy Carter became president, he became the mediator between Begin and Sadat, and the Europeans were also not included. What is interesting in the announcement of the Trump plan is that the Trump plan, by its very pronouncement, is stating emphatically that it doesn't countenance UN resolutions that say that the territories that Israel took in 67 are occupied, because it's actually saying to the Israelis, you may have our permission to annex between 30 and 40% at some point. And what the United States is essentially saying, the UN resolutions that have called for a two-state solution, while this plan calls for a two-state solution, those ideas out of the UN primarily were focused on Israel's leaving almost all the territories taken in the 1967 war. There's no question that everyone's waiting to see what's going to happen in the Palestinian government. Abbas in his mid-80s, not well physically, and we don't know what a change of government will mean in the Palestinian arena. We certainly know that it's not very likely that the Palestinian community that is so divided between the governance in Ramallah and the West Bank and the governance of Hamas in Gaza are prepared to unify and give up this dysfunctional nature of how they rule now two very distinct Palestinian geographic areas. And I think what this plan shows is that Israel remains in the driver's seat in determining security matters. I don't think there's much doubt about that. Here again is the Trump plan. There are many questions that go with it, including who's going to monitor the individual areas that are the enclaves that are going to be established by land swaps, because the areas to the south of Gaza are to be swapped for lands that the Israelis will continue to control. What has been the general Arab reaction to the proposed Trump plan? Again, this is just from the last 2 weeks that I've been able to cobble together. It's not very laudatory of Donald Trump or the plan, and you can expect that. It's a slap, a scandal, a disgrace, a shame or insult of the century. It's a natural and logical outcome of Arab and Muslim worlds that are plagued by wars, conflicts, disputes, famines, divisions, dictatorships, tribulations, occupations, and foreign interventions. There's a real concern that the weakness in the Arab world, or the weakness in inter-Arab politics, or the weakness of Arab states is making it increasingly difficult for the Palestinians to have a strong voice to stand up to Trump and the plan. And then from a Kuwaiti newspaper, the Palestinian area's destruction and the death of the cause's centrality had given rise to the deal of the century. And here's a plea: unless the Palestinians prioritize Palestine, unless Palestinian factions stop doing others' bidding, the day may come when the Palestinians will yearn for this deal as a dream that has slipped away. Polling data, which is published by the Palestinian Center for Public Opinion, over the last 3 years has consistently come up with the reality that 78% of Palestinians believe that the Arab world is preoccupied with its problems and internal conflicts, and that Palestine is not a primary cause. 72% believe an alliance already exists between Sunni Arabs and Israel against Iran, despite the continued Israeli occupation of the territories. There used to be a time, 25 years ago, when Israel's presence in the territories, Israel's building of settlements, was the primary issue on the inter-Arab agenda or an Arab nationalist agenda. Now it is not, with many Arab states severely hurting economically: Lebanon, Iraq, certainly Syria, perhaps Libya. With that, I would ask you, if you have your questions, to use them, and let's see if I might be able to answer them. I'm not going to guarantee it, but I'm certainly going to try. And my good friend Eli will post them up for me to see. And as of now, everyone seems to be relatively satisfied that we touched all the points. So since that's the case, until you can think of, well, we have one from a former student. We're mainly talking about the territorial conflict, which is only a small portion of the Arab-Israel conflict. Does the Trump plan, says our former student, does the Trump plan tackle any of the other issues, political, religious, ethnic, economic? What's the $50 billion for exactly? Well, the Trump plan doesn't speak about Israel's outstanding issues with Syria, or its outstanding issues with Lebanon, or maybe its outstanding issues with other Arab states. It speaks specifically about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And it isn't specifically tackling political, religious, and ethnic economic issues other than the $50 billion, although the Trump plan does state quite explicitly that Israel doesn't have to deal with Hamas until Hamas changes its political outlook, until it renounces its violence against Israel. Now, that's a prerequisite for Israel to negotiate with Hamas, or for Hamas to be recognized. Yes, and what about the money offered to all the Palestinians is another questioner. Well, the money is suggested in the plan. There is no money in the plan. We don't even know where the $50 billion is supposed to come from. And we do know that the international community, after the Israel-Gaza wars, was really chary in providing for the funding they promised. They promised $5.5 or $6 billion. And they didn't come forward with more than half a billion. And a lot of that came from the United States. There's a reluctance on the part of the donors because they're unsure about how the funds will be used and will there be accountability. There's a question from a guy by the name of Shapiro. Thanks for the thorough, insightful update. So where do we go from here? Is it simply dead on arrival, or is there a chance that new life can be breathed into this plan post either Israeli or US elections? Mr. Shapiro, I suspect new life could be breathed into it, but it would require primarily, I think, the Israelis to unilaterally implement a slow change of policy toward the Palestinians in the territories that might allow the Palestinians to increase their economic growth and development, increase trade, and have the Israelis less physical or less visible, I think visible is the best word, as they manage the territories. I'm not certain there's much more that can be said. I think we have to understand that the Trump plan is a declaration. It's an aspiration. It hasn't been negotiated between the parties. Mr. Jacobs asks, what room does the Trump plan leave for negotiating a different map? I think it leaves a lot of room, but it means that the Palestinians themselves might come forward and say, this is what we'd like to offer instead. We'd like to offer X, Y, and Z rather than ABC. But it's not been a habit of the Palestinians to move forward on an outside suggestion because they feel that they're the weaker of the two parties, and they feel the United States is really Israel's advocate. But it doesn't preclude the possibility of a different plan. Ms. Mignon writes from south of the border, if Israel should annex the territory allowed in the Trump plan, how many Palestinians will receive citizenship? I think that's going to depend on Israeli decision-making. I don't think there's anything now that will tell us how many. And I think the Israelis are always going to be careful that the number of Palestinians who might gain citizenship would not be in such a large number that the people who would come in would not have jobs. I think the Israelis would want to be careful that the people who came back, if they did, if families were unified, whatever the idea would be, and this is an idea which Moshe Dayan had years ago, was a reunification plan after the Six-Day War of families. It would have to be carefully calibrated depending upon, I think, funds. Next question is, will the Palestinians be capable of making their own I don't know if they can be. I think they're capable of making their own electrical plants. The question is, will they? Will some outside beneficiary, European, German, French, Belgium, Dutch, provide the expertise or the training or the technological background to make it happen? Yes. There's no reason why Palestinian engineers couldn't do that. I think, again, it's a matter of money and it's a matter of political stability. Mr. Goodman writes, Madrid and Oslo contain significant clauses dealing with issues beyond the core final status questions of border settlement sovereignty. Does the Trump plan treat questions of environmental, especially water, economic, cultural, and cooperation that were contained in the annexes of the Oslo Accords? Mr. Goodman, I'm afraid it doesn't go into the detail that you would like it to go into. And if not, do we think that if such a plan moves forward, its implementation will be found to be too superficial? I think it might be. But then who is it for us to decide? It's really the people on the ground that have to decide what is and what is not superficial. They will find that without consideration of the economic issues, the implementation of the plan was found to be non-viable. The other way of putting it, Mr. Goodman, can the Palestinians satisfy their political feelings by merely having a check written so that people can have a job? And my suspicions are you don't buy off a person's political viewpoint. You can make their political outlooks more in line with nonviolence. But that doesn't mean that you're really going to buy someone's politics. Mr. Seidel, who I detect was once in radio, how much influence do the Saudis and the Gulf states have on the Palestinians? Quite a lot. They can provide funds. In the most recent past, several of the Gulf states have provided funding directly to Hamas in Gaza. And I do know that the Palestinian Arab leadership has periodically gone to Saudi Arabia and gone to some of the Arab states, the Emiratis, for example, looking for funds and finding it. So the influence is there. But the question is, will the Palestinians listen, or do they want to listen to someone from the outside whom they feel has not been strong enough in their opposition to the Trump plan? What do we know about whether and how much influence MBZ, Saudi Arabia, has had on Trump plan? And what do we know about how much MBZ, Saudi Arabia, are using the Trump plan to exert more influence or support vis-a-vis Israel? I am not aware of it. It's not impossible. We do know that Saudi Arabia and Israel have gotten closer over the last 6 months to 18 months, maybe ever since prior to the election of Donald Trump. And we do know that the Israelis and the Saudis have talked on numerous occasions about common problems such as Iran. I'm reasonably certain that the Saudis are very interested in Israel's expertise in cybersecurity. Mr. Sussman, so with a two-state settlement effectively dead, is this reality seen in Israel? And how do they feel about the inevitable demographic situation in a unitary state? I'm not convinced the two-state settlement is effectively dead. What may be effectively dead is Israel's full withdrawal from all the territories taken in the 1967 war. But I'm not yet convinced that a two-state solution has yet found its time to go to the cemetery. You remark they can't have a Jewish state, a democratic state, and the whole of the contested area, only two of the above. I think Israelis understand what it is they want. The question is, will the political system allow them to do it? And will those of us who are on the outside give the Israelis a chance and opportunity to be a little bit patient to see how they can unravel their very complicated political system? Siegfried, how can the Trump plan ignore the UN when without the UN Declaration of 47, there would be no recognition of Israel as a state? Well, it's not really ignoring the UN. The UN recognized Israel's right to exist. Israel was accepted into the UN in 1949. When you ask a question like this, you're asking really, should we be able to turn back history to an earlier time? Could your question have said, how can the Trump plan ignore the UN? Without the UN Declaration of 47, there would be no recognition of Israel. Well, it wasn't Israel as a state, but no recognition of an Arab state, because out of the UN came this suggestion that there should be two states. It didn't happen. And Mr. Shapiro's following up, must be an academic. So we know where Trump stands as far as his plan declaration goes. If there's a change in leadership in the U.S. in November, do you see a path forward for a Democrat to work on a new plan, or would it have to wait a few years until it can happen? You know, presidents, as we know, sometimes believe that when they come to office, they know the right path in foreign affairs. And a lot of times they may just want to distance themselves entirely from their predecessor. We know that Mr. Trump has tried to distance himself from Obama. We know when Carter came to office in '77, he wanted to distance himself from Gerald Ford. We know when Reagan came to office in '81, he didn't want anything to do with Palestinian autonomy that had been negotiated by Carter. He thought that was a bad idea, negotiated by a Democratic president. I think it's really difficult for us to sit here now and try and estimate what's going to happen in January of 2021. What I do think this plan has stated to potential Democratic candidates for president is that the President of the United States has put the gauntlet down, essentially said, this is my view toward America's relationship to Israel. I moved America's embassy to Jerusalem. I said the Israelis could take control or annex the Golan Heights. And I'm essentially saying they have my sanction to go ahead and take control of the Jordan Valley for strategic purposes. Now, we know that there are two Democratic candidates for office, Senators Warren and Senator Sanders, who have made some pretty tough remarks about Israel and about the continuation of foreign aid to Israel if Israel doesn't do X or Y in the territories. Maybe this was Mr. Trump's statement to those two Democratic candidates that this is my view. Are you going to run for office against this view? Of course, we don't know that because we haven't gotten that far along the road. And Mr. Miro, can you remove that, Eli, so I can see the question? Yes. What do the Israeli citizens think about the new proposal? A very good question. I think most Israelis believe that a portion of the West Bank should come under their control for strategic purposes. They're fearful of the Jordan River Valley being under a foreign sovereignty. But I think many Israelis also realize that they have an issue when it comes to what do you do about a very large Palestinian population? That number is almost 3 million. 2 million in the West Bank and maybe another million in Gaza. And that's a problem. And I think the Israeli body politic understands it. What they do about it is again, a very different question. But if you read the Israeli press, I'm not talking about the English press that comes out of Israel, I'm talking about the Hebrew press, you realize that Israelis are fully aware of the problems that they're facing. I know someone who asked the question earlier had their hand up, and if they want to resubmit a question, I'll be glad to take that too. Mr. Miro, Mr. Seigler, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. For many years, there's been an assumption that the birth rate of the Palestinians would exceed Israel's population. The assumption has been that if the Palestinians were granted the right to vote, they would outnumber the Jewish population without increasing the supply of water and electricity to the Palestinians' territory. I can't answer that question. I mean, that has so many variables that I'm so totally incompetent to respond to. I don't know too much about the birth rates. I don't know whether they've gotten less or more over the last 5 to 7 years. Water supply, electricity are absolutely certain for the well-being of any population. I know there's been talk about creating desalinization plants off the Gaza coast and in the Gulf of Aqaba, both to satisfy Israeli water needs in the south and Gaza's water needs, and to satisfy the water needs of Jordan and the water needs of the West Bank. But they've only been discussions. I mean, if I were interested in building up an infrastructure for the territories, what I would think would be absolutely necessary would be finding ways to be sure that there's an ample supply of water for everyone and ample supply of electricity. And if I had my way, which I don't, I would try and find a way to open up the pipeline from Mosul to Haifa again and let the Palestinians enjoy the transit fees from oil that might come from Mosul and end up at Haifa port for transshipment to Europe. And that might be a steady income. But, those of us who sit in Atlanta with snow tonight probably don't get our views heard. Is there any indication that the Palestinians read all 150 pages of the Trump plan as they rejected it before it was presented? Mr. Horowitz, it's 181 pages, actually. When you look at the detail of the plan, there's a lot that's demanded of the Palestinians in this. Really a significant amount. For their state to be recognized, they essentially have to change the kind of regime that they have. They have to have a free press. They may have to have a new constitution. They may have to allow freedom of religion. The Trump plan contains some specific performance clauses for the Palestinians that most other Arab states don't even conform to at this juncture. It's almost as if this was put into the plan so that the Palestinians would have to almost automatically reject it. So that's why I say the plan was declaratory and aspirational. There's nothing in this plan that tells us how it will be implemented, doesn't tell us who's going to mediate it, doesn't tell us who's going to monitor its implementation, doesn't give us a timeline. Maybe it's much too early for that in a plan of this supposed magnitude. But I would personally be very surprised if $1 billion were raised for this plan between now and November. I would be really surprised. It's not impossible because there's a lot of oil wealth in the Middle East. But until the Palestinians can find a way to readjust the manner in which they do bookkeeping and accounting and run their economy, there are many outsiders who are going to be reluctant to provide them with the funds that are really necessary. Let me just reiterate that we're going to archive the webinar. We're going to send you all information on how you get to it. And I want to thank you, a very large number of you who joined us this evening. It's very gratifying to know that you're still interested and that you participated fully. You asked some really tough and good questions. And again, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and enjoy the rest of the spring.